Today, I think we've agreed we'll probably try to cover the first two substantive chapters of The Matter with Things. And the first chapter itself is I think, fascinatingly specific about evolutionary issues, how we can have a brain that's formed in the way that it is. And the second chapter is much more phenomenological. It's about what happens to the world when the right hemisphere is not able to underwrite attention. So that's going to be the subject of the second part of our talk. The issue with which I begin is this whole question of why the brain is asymmetrical, and indeed why it's divided in the way that it is, and if so, how the other parts connected. And effectively, what I show, I think, is that from the earliest origins of a neural net, the ancestor of our brain, there is an asymmetry in this net. And I may have referred to this in our previous session, but this seems to be in service of allowing a creature to do two impossibly difficult things to do at once, which is to pay very narrowly focused attention to the world and pay very broad, sustained, vigilant attention to the world. And when the brain that we have, the mammalian brain begins, there are a number of things that alter in the shape and the functioning of the brain, and they're to do with what Sir Charles Sherrington, the great neurophysiologist at the end of the 19th century, called opponent processes. Opponent processes are a means whereby you can make a very fine movement or a very fine change by using two powers, one pushing in one direction and one pushing in the other. It's rather like if you were trying to make a very delicate brush stroke on a painting. You wouldn't leave your hand free. You'd probably steady the hand one way, and then you can push very slightly with the other hand and make very, very small adjustments. The brain, the whole body is based on these opponent processes. There's the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, there are extensor muscles and there are flexor muscles, and so on. But in the brain, there are three important pairs of opponent processes. The one, obviously, that is the subject of The Matter with Things is the lateral opponent processing between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, which already suggests that they can work well with a sort of combination of competition and collaboration. A second one is, and really historically that's probably the more important one, is the development of the neocortex, which is the main part of what we now think of as the brain, the brain that evolved later on top of what's sometimes called the reptilian brain. And the third is the relationship between the frontal cortex and the posterior cortex of each hemisphere. We won't probably go into much of the detail here, but there is some interest in how we ended up with this structure, which I think has to do with the way in which mammals evolved in the first instance. So we're talking about millions of years ago. The first mammals were living in a world of very large, rather lumbering reptiles. And they were very small creatures. They were probably somewhat like shrews or mice. They were living close to the ground, possibly underground a lot of the time, and often coming out only at night. So they needed, in order to negotiate their way around the world, particularly a complicated set of somatosensory, a much more sophisticated sense of range of somatosensory stimuli in order to be able to orientate themselves. And to cut a long story short, that actually results in this enormous expansion of the neocortex, which enables us to integrate information across the visual field, across the sensory, somatosensory field, because it turns out that in these small animals, the hairs on their body were as important as their eyes. They were, as I say, close to the ground. They were nocturnal creatures and so forth. So these creatures managed, as we know, in the end, to evolve very successfully at the expense of the reptiles that seemed to rule when they first appeared on the Earth. They did this partly by becoming extremely responsive to the environment and by being able to integrate that information using this larger brain. Now, the trouble about a large brain is that obviously there's much more information to transmit from one side of the brain to the other. And in reptiles, birds, fish, there is no corpus callosum. There is no band of fibers like the corpus callosum to connect the two hemispheres. There are a couple of very small, exiguous commissures, but they're not like the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum evolved in order to solve the problem of how you get a lot of information to another part of the brain quickly. One of the ways to do this is to route things nearer the middle so that information doesn't have to go forwards or backwards in the hemisphere before it can cross over. And another is the invention of a way you can make a super fast cable connection by myelinating nerves. That's to say, there is a thin sheath of myelin, which is a fatty substance around the nerve, and this enormously speeds up transmission. When we talk about white matter in the brain, what we mean by white matter is in fact myelinated matter. The trouble with myelinated nerves is they take up more room. So you've got a problem. You want to expand this process because there's more information to communicate. But at the same time, if you do try to do this efficiently and quickly, you will take up more room in the brain. And so evolution was forced to make a distinction between the things that it had to communicate and those things that could be left unspoken about or uncommunicated. That means specialization. And so effectively, overall, what you find is that the bigger the brain, the more specialized the hemispheres are. And indeed, the more specialized are some of the areas within each hemisphere. When you come to primates, a lot of the traffic across the corpus callosum is inhibitory. And in the human case, probably more of the information crossing the corpus callosum is there in order to tell the other hemisphere, keep out of this because I'm dealing with it. You can actually become very inefficient by having two different, as it were, sensors trying to do the same task in different ways at the same time. So one of the things that I think probably most people don't appreciate is how much of our brain is in general taken up with inhibition, the stopping of things happening. And the frontal lobes are the perfect example of this. The development of the frontal lobes was effectively a way of being able to inhibit the immediate reactions to stimuli in the older posterior cortex. So there's always this checks and balances arrangement from front to back, from top to bottom, and from side to side in the brain. And in primates and humans, an enormous amount, something like 30% of all the neurons in the body, in the brain, are inhibitory in nature. And as we go on speaking more philosophically about what it is to be a human being, this idea that inhibition is creative, that the negative is there in order to make things happen, not just to stop them happening, is a very important theme.
Indeed.
And then
yes.
yeah.
Well, I probably you want to move on, but let me just remark how interesting it is in that in this relatively brief chapter 1, in comparison to other chapters, that starting with evolution and how evolution brings forth this split as brains grew, that this split involves reciprocal constraints, which are not necessarily negative. So there is this idea already emerging in chapter 1 of your book, that those constraints are creative, so that opposition can be creative. And already I can see in chapter 1 something very neat, which is that this idea is articulated or manifested concretely in the physiology and also abstractly in the philosophy, if you wish. And so I think it's important to remark maybe that part 1, which you've entitled The Hemispheres and the Means to Truth, already attests to that, right? That there are two hemispheres and that they involve two means to truth. And as I see, the rest of the book is gonna be about, well, what are these, how different they are, and to what extent they bring forth different worlds, and which one should be in charge of. But that's a very nice, again, that starting with evolutionary facts, if you want, about how we got here, you can already lay down these two streams of the hardcore clinical and neurophysiological data in some detail, and also all the philosophical resonances that are right there from the beginning. That's really nice, Iain.
Yes, thanks very much, Alex. I think that's a very, very good point to make. And it's very concrete as well. I mean, it's been known since the late 19th century that if there's a lesion somewhere in the central nervous system, and even in the peripheral nervous system sometimes, a lesion on the opposite side can improve the situation. So there is a matter of balance between these hemispheres, which is also another philosophically interesting point. Indeed. Because, I mean, just to make it very explicit, for two specialized units to work together well, they shouldn't try to do the same job. They should try to do complementary jobs. I sometimes give the image of a surgical operation which requires a surgeon and a scrub nurse, and it wouldn't be better if the scrub nurse tried to do the operation and the surgeon tried to be the scrub nurse. So they have different roles, and because they're different, they work well together, not because they're the same. Yeah.
Very soon the balance will be truncated, right? Well, so now from this you move to chapter 2, in which, as I see it, attention is central. As you say, it's not just one more cognitive function that we want to talk about, but attention is what really brings forth a world, not just allows us to see, but brings forth a world, right?
Exactly. In fact, I say attention changes the world. So the way in which we look governs the kind of world that we find coming to attention, and it changes us, the ones who are paying the attention. So it's a very fundamental point, and there's quite a lot in chapter 2. I wonder what the best.
Let me jump in. So how I'll see it, it's going to be let me put it this way metaphorically. It's like a psychological profiling of the left hemisphere mainly. And of course, maybe we should explain or make explicit that we're going to be referring to the left testes, the right, as if there were two people, right? And of course, that's not what it's meant. But clearly, as you're bringing forth all these, very concrete data, we can start to build up and realize that how the left hemisphere pays attention as opposed to the right, and what it is missing, and the fact that it's not only missing things, but that it is missing things, and that then when pushed forth, it will be in denial. And you continue, it's like a novel, right? As if it was this character, which is the left hemisphere. And the things get worse and worse in a way, all the way to, not caring about the animate and losing the whole and being confabulatory and so on. So to me, chapter 2 is this story about what can be learned from sometimes from just very few cases and the power of lesions and the insight they bring forth, sometimes even just with interviews or drawing exercises or conversations. So how this starts revealing these two means to truth. That's how I would summarize, without saying very much concrete things. That's how I would summarize.
Yes.
Chapter 2 is.
No, thank you. That's very good. Perhaps I should begin by making some reflections on attention overall and the way in which the hemispheres subserve it. One of the things that I think will surprise many people is, because they may, if they know something about the nervous system in humans, they may know that speech is very largely controlled by the left hemisphere. Speech is a distinct thing from language as such, but speaking is, in most people, very much a left hemisphere function. But what is intriguing is that the governance of attention is more strongly lateralized to the right hemisphere, even than speech is to the left. So the point is that the right hemisphere is the governor of attention, and it can pay both kinds of attention, the kind that the left hemisphere pays and the kind that the right hemisphere pays, if it has to. But for the proper functioning of the organism, generally that narrow, highly focused attention is delegated to the left hemisphere. But the switching of attention is also under right hemisphere control. So it is the king of attention, if you like. This is also evidence in certain things that happen when right hemisphere is dysfunctional to the attention that can be paid. The first thing is that attention becomes narrow, as you might imagine. There's this pathological narrowing of the window of attention. And that means that you may become unaware of anything going on outside the immediate focus of attention. Secondly, there is an interesting phenomenon called neglect, hemi-neglect, which is a term that describes what happens principally after right hemisphere damage, when the left hemisphere is left in control of attention. And the only part of the world, in some cases, that the patient, the sufferer, can see or can be aware of, I should say, is on the right half of space, including the right half of the body and the right half of everything, not just visually, but orally through the ears and so forth. So that's a rather striking difference. It demonstrates so forcibly to me that the left hemisphere is concerned merely with grasping. I have made this point many times, but it's quite stunning that it is so interested in grasping alone that it deals with and considers real only the half of space where its right hand does the grasping. That's a very odd thing. It very, very rarely happens, and when it does, it's much less marked the other way around. So it is a very strongly asymmetrical phenomenon. Then there is the fact that the left hemisphere has rather sticky attention, so it locks on to a subject. And this, of course, goes with its role as a predator. It's looking for something it wants to get, something to eat, something to use. And so it locks onto a stimulus that it knows is important to it, and it won't let go of it. After a right hemisphere stroke, after a right hemisphere damage of some kind, individuals sometimes find their attention arrested by often an inanimate object in the right half of the visual field, and they have to be sometimes helped to disengage from it actively. So the attention is narrow, the attention is only half a world, and it's very difficult to shift within that world. You get stuck. And there's also something else called the attentional blink, which is more marked in the left hemisphere. The attentional blink means that after you've registered a stimulus as important, there is a refractory period before you can register another one. It's very short. It's a matter of hundredths of a second, but it does exist. But it's something like 3 times as long in the left hemisphere. So you've got a number of features that show that it's not going to find it easy to construct a real world. But what's absolutely amazing from a philosophical point of view is experiments that show that people who are functioning only on the left hemisphere literally don't believe that the left half of space that would normally be brought into being for us by the right hemisphere, they just believe that that part of space doesn't exist, and they're not aware of it not existing. They also are not aware of it ever having existed or that it might exist in the future. So there is a collapse of reality in space and a collapse of reality in time. Sometimes this is very marked. So, a person who is not in any way delusional or mad will absolutely refuse to accept either that part of their body is no longer, is paralyzed, no longer working if it's on the left. And they will sometimes even refuse to talk about it. So they're carrying on a conversation, and when their attention is drawn to it, they just absolutely freeze and stare, and then will only start talking again when it comes back to talking about the right side of the body. There's also a lovely experiment which I might mention, because it's so beautiful, which was carried out by Biziak and Rizzolatti, I think it was, in Milan in the 1970s. And this involved subjects who'd had a right hemisphere stroke. And they were asked to imagine that they were standing in the Piazza del Duomo in Milan, the cathedral square in Milan, one of the most famous urban scenes in the world, and to describe what they saw. And looking at the front of the cathedral, they recalled, quite orderly, the buildings that went down the right-hand side of the square. But they didn't mention the ones that were on the left. So the experimenters later asked them, well, imagine you're standing in front of the cathedral with your back to it, looking the other way down the square. And now they were able to remember and recall and name the buildings on the right, but not the ones on the left. So again, it looks as though the things on the left simply no longer exist for this person. Now, since I think I show throughout the book the very close relationship between attention and the nature of the world, not just the how of it, but the what of it, and in this case, the whether at allness of it. If the left hemisphere doesn't know that it exists, it just doesn't exist for it at all, and never has and never will do. So that is a very remarkable finding.
And there's no way to bring it forth by force or by some clever experimentation. Is it really sealed, or are there any ways in which you can make it acknowledge that there's something it's missing?
I think you're hinting perhaps at Ramachandran's experiments with the mirror and so on. But what he finds extraordinary is that even though the person knows, in a way knows that the space that's in the mirror is on the left, they still try to find things in it on the right side in the mirror. So there's an enormous number of very beautifully reported clinical cases that I draw on in that chapter. And to give some idea of the degree of unwillingness to acknowledge the existence of, say, any defunct or dysfunctional part of the body on the left, there are conversations that in which the clinician tries to ask the patient about their left hand, draws attention to the left hand, says, can you move it? They say they can. When they don't, they say, why did you not move it? I just didn't want to. And then go even further and say, it's not my hand anyway, that's yours, doctor. And then another case, the patient has his or her hand on the table and the clinician taps the patient's hand and says, whose hand is this? They say, well, it's not mine. Well, if it's not yours, whose is it? Well, it isn't yours then, doctor. No, well, whose is it? It belongs to my son. It's really phenomenal ability to make up something plausible to this very strange consciousness that isn't at all plausible in any consciousness that's got contact with the real world.
Yes. It reminded me of the stories of Oliver Sacks as I was reading these cases in the chapter, and it's beyond science fiction in a way how the mind can work upon certain lesions. Even being very creative, one could not have, at least I could not have, just imagined such cases, right? It's really unbelievable, which makes us reconsider like the kind of miracle that our brains are by more or less working and more or less getting us through life the moment you see these malfunctions and what they do to our minds, right?
Yes. It's probably worth saying, because some people will be thinking, well, yes, but when people have got damage to their brain, it's another matter. But presumably our normal brains are not working like this. But what's beautiful is that you can temporarily induce a state in which one or other hemisphere is suppressed. And this is a perfectly normal person. You or me goes into, well, if we're normal people, goes into the experimental room, has TMS applied to one half of the brain so that it's suppressed. And immediately these phenomena, some of them begin to happen. They don't see things on the left, they don't acknowledge body parts on the left, and so forth. So what I thought I just mentioned some of the types of misunderstandings that go on when the left hemisphere is suppressed in relation to the body. And then we'll perhaps talk a little bit, I think, about changes in space more generally, changes in time, changes in emotion, and changes in the sense of animacy, the devitalization of the world, which you hinted at a few minutes ago. So there are a number of overlapping conditions. One doesn't need to, perhaps, for the purposes of this talk, go into them in detail, though I do in the book. But effectively, there's denial of part of the body, belief that the part of the body belongs to another person altogether. There's denial that there is any deficit. And there is a kind of strange affect, which is very striking, which is a kind of fatuous indifference to there being a problem, which is sometimes jokey, sometimes irritable, and sometimes dismissive, but effectively is not engaging with the fact that there is something very importantly wrong with their humanity. Their whole being, some part of it has gone missing. Now, you might say, well, what happens when the person has a left hemisphere stroke? Do you get the same thing happening on the other side? And the answer is you don't. No. In fact, it has been suggested that maybe the denial that happens after left hemisphere damage is something like the psychodynamic model of Freud's denial, the denial of something that is uncomfortable and painful. But it isn't like that, because when the situation is reversed and there is damage to the left hemisphere and there is therefore dysfunction on the right, you don't find this denial at all. In fact, the person's emotions are properly engaged with the situation. So I think those are all rather intriguing. And then there are so-called reduplicative phenomena of various kinds, where, for example, the continuity of a single unique individual, say somebody as close to you as your spouse, may fragment, so that you see that this person who you used to know very well seems to be being copied by a very good mimic, somebody who is miming the part. And it's not really your spouse at all, it's somebody else who's impersonating your spouse. And there is another, but that's known as Capgras syndrome. There's one called Frege syndrome, where people see not that somebody they know has been replaced by somebody else, but somebody they don't know has been replaced by somebody they do know. An example of that is a patient of mine who accused her husband of two-timing her, because when she went out shopping, she saw him in all kinds of places in the town talking to people when he should have been at work. But actually that, those were all misidentifications. So delusional misidentification is the phenomenon where the normally integrated person, integrated emotionally, integrated in space, integrated in time, is broken down so that it becomes just a series of fragmented slices in time, slices of a person. It's no longer the whole person at all. I think those are really extraordinary. What do you think, Alex?
Well, so each of them by itself is incredible. Now, I'm wondering whether where's the controversy here, in the sense that, and by the way, let me just in passing mention that you're of course providing the references for all these cases and works, and the typesetting, it's just gorgeous, and it goes to the left side of the margins of the page, and there's space also for annotation. Well, that's more like a reader's note if you read with a pen, as I do. Now, talking about the references, I suppose, but you please tell me, like each of those in isolation again would be in a way perfectly fine to the community to say, well, that's what's happening. That's what's happening. Now, it's where you start compiling them and drawing this landscape of what's going on as the difference between left and right hemispheres, where the whole picture starts to emerge. And so what do the professionals, your colleagues, think as this, or is it because people don't do this synthetic work because it's too much, or when people do it, they are not so inclined to draw general conclusions based on that picture? Because I see the thesis of your book emerging out of these facts, right, together with the philosophy. And I'm wondering why it has taken so long, or why it seems to be controversial that you're presenting these radical views of what the left and the right hemispheres do.
Well, yes, it is probably controversial, that's right, because nobody has gone near this topic for a very long time, which left open a very ripe field for inquiry, in my view. I simply do what science should be doing, which is to ask questions. Why is it like this? And what exactly are we seeing here? You could, of course, point out that the left hemisphere's normal way of approaching this is absolutely piecemeal, as you say. Well, we have this bit of information about this condition. So the things that I refer to, they're not disputed. I mean, they're well described and they're well accepted. It's just putting them together to create a picture. It's rather like that famous picture of the Dalmatian dog, where you see lots of spots and splashes, and then there comes an aha moment when you see the whole picture. I think readers describe this, and a lot of scientific readers do too. I don't generally get people being skeptical about the neuropsychological part of the books. What they often don't feel comfortable with is taking that information beyond the clinical setting to making philosophical points about the way we function in the world. Well, that's just a matter of opinion, and I think some people are comfortable with that and some aren't. For myself, the philosophical consequences of this are extraordinary and need to be explored.
So to trace back, well, I was going to say the argument, but it's not really the argument, it's like the structure. You're interested in truth. And of course, you mentioned, well, in order to know what is truth, we need to care about the mind. And in order to care about the mind, we need to care about brains. And not to say that both are equivalent. I think you and I don't think that's the case. And now,
No.
when we think about brains, we have this exquisite landscape of what's going on, especially in these clinical cases. Now we analyze those, and then we make the synthesis back. But then you start drawing conclusions or generalizing or interpretations about, as we were saying some minutes ago, well, this is what happens in some strange cases, but you can show that in arguably healthy people, if we can put it this way, you could induce those. Now, would the next two claims be, and in our daily life, of course, it's not going to be black and white, but we can have tendencies of what's dominating. And then at the level of civilization, there can be an accumulated imbalance, if you wish. And that's the malaise we're going through now. So can you walk us through this back and forth kind of tide?
Yes, and then we'll come back to the attention chapter. But yes, in asking the question, what can we believe to be more true than something else, we have to contend with the very extraordinary fact that the brain is producing two realities. One of them is a reality that most of us would accept. That's what the right hemisphere is providing. But the left hemisphere induces a very special state of mind in which certain things that we would normally think to be the case are no longer held to be the case. So how do we balance these two things? Because they're both there. And in leading our lives, we do balance these two things for some purposes, having decontextualized abstract concepts is helpful. It's helpful for doing manipulation, for and there I'm talking about manipulation of ideas. Let's try out a theory. Let's put this into the machine and see what comes out. So we do use that, but the important thing is we always should be taking it back, now that it's been unfolded and made explicit, into the world of the right hemisphere where it can be integrated. The problem is that if you leave it with what the left hemisphere sees, you have a disintegrated, a meaningless heap of fragments. You have a world that makes no sense. And you made the important point that there is a difference between what goes on in a human being from day to day, where these things are, as I say, balanced to a certain extent, though people can be trained by the way in which they've been educated, or they can have a natural inclination to favor one or other
Yes.
kinds of ways of looking at the world. But there's a difference between that and what happens at the level of a civilization. And that's because, particularly in the kind of civilization that we have now, where the way in which we deal with ideas is by public debate in a very explicit fashion, not dealing as in the past people did with reality through poetry, ritual, mythology, narrative, music, drama, all these ways in which we can integrate the more complex picture of the world that the right hemisphere has, but largely by a series of logical propositions. And that is the way in which the left hemisphere constructs, or as I would say, misconstructs the world. But the difficulty is that if you want to balance these two ways of seeing things, you look as though you're contradicting yourself, and it's much easier to dismiss somebody if you can show that they've contradicted themselves than it is to show that the picture that they've got of the world makes no sense at all. So what happens is that people are frightened off saying things that in fact are not very easily said in explicit language. That's why we have art. That's why we have spiritual and religious literature. These things get sidelined. And so what I aim to do in the book is to ask the question, first of all, which of these two ways of looking at the world is more veridical? And at the end of part one, after we've looked at these various portals to truth, attention, perception, judgment, emotional and social intelligence, cognitive intelligence, and creativity, these are the ways in which we can get news about the world, or bring a certain kind of world into being for us. Which of these is the more veridical? And the answer is that in every case, it is effectively the right hemisphere that has the upper hand. So coming back, I think, to the business of attention, one of the ways in which one can see that is, well, we've seen a few, that it denies realities, it makes up stories, that's called confabulation, to make sense of something. When the left hemisphere doesn't know the answer to something, it doesn't say, I don't know, it makes up something plausible and sort of believes it. So again, there's wonderful descriptions of this happening in the text of the chapter. But there are also other ways, and they involve some things as basic as time, space, and emotion. So when there are abnormalities of the perception of time, these are very heavily skewed towards damage to or dysfunction in the right hemisphere more than the left, very, very much more than the left. So it's clear that having a solid understanding of time as a continuous process, being able to assess duration, being able to see the connections between what the left hemisphere thinks of as points in time, that the right hemisphere sees as duration of time, being able to understand that is highly dependent on the right hemisphere. So what happens when people have damage to the right hemisphere? Quite often the world becomes fragmented in a way that you would get if you had stop-go animation, if you were switching on and off very rapidly the control on a video so that it jerked forwards. For people as old as I am, we can remember cinefilm that could sometimes get stuck in the projector and it would judder onwards. This is the kind of way in which reality seems. It seems discontinuous. It also changes in relation to space. And what happens effectively there, in summary, is that it becomes two-dimensional. The depth of space is no longer there. A third thing that happens, which is a combination of time and space, is to do with motion. Motion slows down at the center of the field of vision, which is the bit the left hemisphere is principally responsible for. Now, when the right hemisphere is not there to counterbalance this immobilizing stare of the left hemisphere, people find that things that are in the focus of their attention seem to either cease to move at all or slow right down. But then as they move out of the focus of attention, they then speed up again. So there's a story of a 62-year-old man in a Viennese cafe, and he has a stroke, goes out into the street, and he wonders why, when he looks at a car, it seems to slow right down and almost come to a stop. But when he looks away, he sees it speed off. So this is an extraordinary distortion of reality, but it demonstrates there's a problem with time and a problem with space. In other words, a problem with flow, which is something that will become increasingly important in the philosophical explorations of parts 2 and 3 of the book.
And very timely
One
you
thing
mentioned.
that
Sorry, just I was going to say it's timely you mentioned this, because this week is the 100th year anniversary of the meeting that Bergson and Einstein had, where they were discussing about the nature of time and what it is and how it's measured, whether we're missing something when we're measuring it. And as you were talking about this distinction between points in space and duration, it made me think of the origin, as I understand, of the origin of that controversy. It probably, I'm not going to say Bergson or Einstein was left and right and so on, but probably both were right. But the point was that if the physicist negates any meaning to the time of the philosopher, then we're back in a situation where, well, perhaps all we can offer is confabulation, because we're missing essential aspects of the world, and there's no way to bring them back from that standpoint. Well, sorry for the footnote, but it's really timely and important, because in a way that seems to me the origin of this radical split, going back to the opposites between science and philosophy, and a split that's perhaps not been as creative as it could have been, because these negatives have been taken as destroying themselves rather than, you know, working in combination as opposites.
Yes, well, I'm sure we'll come on to talk about the meeting of Bergson and Einstein later. It's not as the stories about how it worked out are not really how the thing happened. We need to talk about that.
Yes.
Bergson in no way denied the view of time that Einstein had. He simply saw at another level the meaning of this in human terms. So, yes, there's a rather wonderful pair of descriptions. One, a patient of Fred Ovsius, who was having a shower and had a right hemisphere stroke while having the shower. And he remembers that suddenly, as he looked at the shower head, he could see each drop coming out, suspended in space, frozen, as it were. And then when he looked away, it moved, it speeded up. And he says it was something like the Matrix, you know, this thing with bullets going very slowly through space. And it's the opposite of what happened to the neuroanatomist Jill Bolte Taylor, who describes her having a left hemisphere stroke while having a shower. So be careful when you have a shower. It's not as innocent a business as it looks. But she describes this sudden roar of the onset of the power of the water. So she was plugged in, as it were, to the whole movement of the water. And the man who had the right hemisphere stroke suddenly saw frozen droplets. It's a very beautiful way of seeing this contrast.
Yes, indeed.
So if you have a vision of the world that is flattened, this also may not sound that significant, but of course it's the distinction between a representation, either on a screen or a painting or a diagram, which can only be two-dimensional, a map can only be two-dimensional, of a world that is actually three-dimensional. And it's this, we come back to this contrast between the rather impoverished schematic version of the world, which increasingly we're taking for the reality of the lived, experienced world. So those two elements begin to lose depth, the depth in time and the depth in space. And perhaps just before leaving that, I ought to mention that you can't make a line, an extension in space, out of points in space, Points only exist in a line once the line has already come into being. So once you have the extension that is a line, you can point to a point in it. But you can't make a line by adding point to point, because a point has no extension in space whatever. And so even an infinite number of them will never produce a line. A line is something separate from any point. And the same thing happens in time. If you imagine time is composed of instants, then you've misunderstood the nature of time, because there are only instants when you reflect backwards on time and freeze a frame. You can't actually make time going forward by adding slice to slice. So this is the reason I'm saying this is this is absolutely fundamental to the distinction between a frozen, schematic, abstracted, devitalized schema and the actual business of being in the flow of life. No, I was going to say there's also a loss of depth, not just in space and time, but in emotion. And I think I've referred to that very briefly. But that when people have right hemisphere strokes, they become incapable of the deeper emotions like empathy, sorrow, guilt, whatever. They appear rather irritable, rather jokey in a sort of superficial way, and somewhat fatuous. And their affect in psychiatric terms becomes shallow compared with the deeper affect of somebody who is making who is still in connection with the world in the sense of feeling. Sorry, Alex, you were going to say something.
Well, no, because you're covering all these steps of narrow attention, in denial, disembodied as well, disowning, the role of emotion, and also finally in the chapter you speak about the loss of the whole, right? Because there are all these kind of adjectives that are qualifying what's going on. But I think when you reach to that point in chapter 2, that's quite synthesizing for me, because maybe that's what you were also trying to illustrate with the example of the line and the dots, which is that from parts, well, many people believe through emergence, which to me sometimes sounds as a free miracle. From parts you get to wholes, but here we're saying, well, it's more like from wholes you can go to parts. Now, how are you going to go back? Which reminds me to what happens when one hemisphere just takes, the left hemisphere takes control, and now it's kind of stuck in a way, and it would need the right one to rescue it, because it's the one that can offer this vision of the whole. And this is, in a way, to me, very paradigmatic of the neural data, if you want, and the philosophical discussions that vertebrate your book. This irreversibility and this centrality of wholeness.
Yes, that's right. When an organism grows, it's not as though the body parts are put together. The organism grows as a whole, and within the whole, little bits begin to differentiate themselves, and they will later be the heart, the spleen, the lungs, whatever it is, a limb. But it's not as though those things exist and are put together in the growth of an organism. Rather, there is an undifferentiated whole that becomes more and more differentiated, but they can only be understood in relation to the whole from which they're never separate. Equally, it's not just a body or an organism, but we understand anything that we call a thing because of the context in which it tends to lie. When we change the context, it will change its nature. If you decontextualize something, you no longer understand it in the way you would have done when it's in context. There are many, many examples of this, but I won't stop off to amuse us with those at the moment. But to your big point is a very good one. You just as you can't make extension in time or space from points, you can't actually make a living whole out of the pieces, which is why the mind that thinks that everything is put together like a machine sees that there only are mechanisms, and that these mechanisms only are dead. They're not the living, contextually understood organism. That's a fantastically important point. And what you find when, again, from the lesion literature is extraordinary, really, that somebody who knows in essence that you're asking them to draw parts of an elephant. You're asking them to draw an elephant. They will draw only a series of parts in a sort of disjunctive way. They don't have any grasp of the overall animal or of a person. They find you ask them to put together a mannequin of a person with just basically a trunk, a head, 2 arms and 2 legs, and they'll fit the arms or the legs in completely the wrong places. But they understand the parts, but they don't understand the whole.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning
And
that, because
going
it's one
with
of
that,
the. Sorry, thank you for mentioning that, because it's one of the drawings you include, and it's visually so compelling. Of course, that the whole story can be complicated, but used to big data and sophisticated analysis, and there you have those people to whom you asked to draw, and this distinction between parts and wholes. It's graspable even by a kid looking at the drawing the person made, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, later we'll come to people who have a right hemisphere stroke and can name and use tools and instruments, but they can't name or conceive things that are non-instrumental and alive. So it is really remarkable. What you find is that body parts are seen as separate items in the left hemisphere, but the whole body, the body taken as a whole, the body image in every modality is in the right hemisphere. I say it's in the right hemisphere in the sense that destroying areas of the right hemisphere will remove the body image or distort the body image, and damage to or impairment of the equivalent areas of the brain in the left hemisphere does not. So the whole body is, as it were, something lived and experienced and known in the right hemisphere, but only body parts in a sort of objective way are known in the left hemisphere. So that cutting up analysis has a deep connection with depriving something of life, killing it. As Wordsworth said, we murder to dissect. So that's a distinction. One little detail that I completely love is that there are a few things, just a handful of things, that we would not think of as living, that actually sort with living things in the right hemisphere. And one of them is musical instruments. So musical instruments are not seen as tools. They're seen as part of an extension of the body, which I think is absolutely beautiful.
Well, sorry if I've been pushing you ahead, but this is so exciting that I immediately jump to these points that are going to be coming throughout the book. Just to come back to attention again, and maybe to start wrapping up, Ian. So perhaps now it's clearer, at least it's clearer to me, why you chose to start with attention. And yet the first part of your book can be thought of as William James reloaded, right? Because you're using the table of contents of the principles of psychology as memory, attention, perception, and so on. But here, maybe now you could emphasize again why attention is the starting point, and in a way how that now will naturally lead to perception and other, if you want, cognitive faculties, but grounding it in attention back to the worlds and this difference between seeing the world and bringing it forth.
Yes. Of course, I argue that it's not that we make up reality in our heads and there's no real anything, quote, out there. Nor is it the case that there just is something out there and we have to get to know it, and our knowing of it doesn't contribute in any way to what it is. So it's a back and forth, as you suggest, between the attending person and what is attended to. And we'll talk, no doubt, much more about a kind of open attention, which is prepared to be highly receptive, but without preconception. That is a kind of attention that the right hemisphere is best at paying, and we can train ourselves to attend in that way through skills such as mindfulness, meditation, and so on. But the point I'm making there is that the attention that we pay to the world does alter what happens there. And we know this as a fact in physics, don't we, Alex? I mean, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we are clear that attending to something changes what is there. And this is a beautiful physical parallel or metaphor for what happens psychologically. That when we attend in one way, we see one thing. If we attend with a quite different kind of attention, a more open, more sustained, or more vigilant attention, or a more engaged attention, we find something different. If you only are used to paying the dissecting, analytic attention and distancing yourself completely from what you find, you'll find the world is a cold, meaningless heap of fragments. So what we mean by reality is going to depend on attention from the word go. And it's a very deep thing, attention. I mean, I often quote the French existentialist philosopher Louis Lavelle, who said this wonderful thing: La charité est une pure attention à l'autrui, which means charity, but in this sense meaning love, the love that's referred to by St. Paul. Love is a pure attention to the existence of the other. And so it's actually a creative act, but it's also an integrating act in every sense, an emotionally engaging act.
I was in conversation recently with Michel Bitbol on phenomenology as understanding in a Husserlian way, not phenomenology as when we say, well, describe what you see out there, which is how most of us would use the word phenomenon, that thing that appears, as opposed to mechanism, by the way, like the causal factor that brings it forth. But in any case, we were discussing phenomenology, and we were discussing the blind spot, in this case of science, and in relationship to quantum mechanics, since you mentioned it. And despite the many interpretations of quantum mechanics, what's very interesting, Michel was pointing out that they would all agree in the fact that it is the scientist is there, and if it's left out of the equation, something essentially is missing. So it was a reminder of the whole and the importance of the whole, and restating this blind spot that we have the moment we think we can remove ourselves from the equation. And then there can be many interpretations as really what's the effect, even like takes about reality out there. But the moment we pretend we're not there, it's a blind spot. And because it's a blind spot, again, making this analogy in this case with the eye, no matter how you sample things, you're going to be always missing that piece of data, which is crucial and upon which everything you're doing stands, which is also true physiologically. So going back to the hemispheres and the ways to truth, like it's because of you have the optic nerve that you can, send all that information, but that very optic nerve is causing you a blind spot. So I always feel in reading your book, and this is more a general comment, that it's an effort to bootstrap myself in my perceptual habits, cognitive habits, and attentional habits. Is this effort of, as well, I don't know if it's Bergson who said it or Jan Kelevich, but it's like drawing more from ourselves, from what we seem to have, right? And in trying to realize that there can be other modes of attention that we probably don't practice in our daily life. So this is not just clinical work or, academic facts that can be puzzling to the lay people. This affects really how we live our lives. So maybe this is a good way to land our discussion today. This is not just two people talking about very sophisticated findings and what they may mean. This has implications for how we look at our families or at the people in the street or at the news or at our very cats, in a way.
Yes. Thank you. That's very true, and it's borne out for me by the number of people who told me that after reading The Master and His Emissary, their whole view of the world changed. And it's something that people have said about the matter with things as well already, that it actually changes the way you see the world, and you won't see it the same way again. So, health warning. This book may seriously improve your health. So No, thank you very much. I think that's right. To be serious, it is an attempt, as I say, to address the question, who are we? And that question is such a fundamental one. I think we've lost sight of who we are. And this book is an attempt to regain an understanding of who we are and how we relate to the world, which is neither that we make it up, nor that it exists in some realm completely apart from us. It's the coming together, an encounter that produces reality. It's out of the encounter of a consciousness with the rest of what I would claim is also a conscious world. And it's out of that encounter that things come forward.
Beautiful. So that sounds like a perfect invitation for our next conversation.